Okay, let me move on to the neurodevelopmental disorders. And to do that, I have to talk about the 5 pathogenic realms. And Diane keeps referring to these as like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. 5 pathogenic realms with their shields. Okay. There are thought to be particular environmental and family constellations and events that create problems in children. And there are certain disorders that are thought to arise from the 5 pathogenic realms. And what are they? What are the 5 pathogenic realms? I'm so glad you asked. Persistent disregard of a child's emotional needs. I'm sorry. Yes. Persistent disregard of a child's physical needs and or repeated changes in primary caregivers. So this might be a child in foster care, for example, or raised in settings with limited opportunities for attachment, and this might be in orphanages, particularly in other countries, and, quote, persistent harsh parenting or other types of grossly inept parenting. Now, for those of you who are parents, you know that your children think that you are grossly inept. But in fact, there is no existing good definition of grossly inept parenting, nor is there a good definition of harsh punishment. Because as we know, this changes geographically. Across the United States, for example, you can find tremendous regional differences in punishment. It also changes with SES, socioeconomic status. It changes with ethnicity, though more by SES. So one of the questions is going to be, how would you document if you wanted to make a CPS report, or you wanted to show that a disorder was due to harsh punishment or grossly inept parenting? And probably everybody is going to have some kind of written document at whatever agency you work at, or whether you work in private practice, that has some guidelines that you're not making up on the fly for the one person you feel you need it for, but something that you think about a priori. So having talked about those, I'm now going to go to a class of children's disorders that are not due to the psychopathic realms, psychogenic realms, sorry. So the neurodevelopmental disorders, I know a few, right?
I guess make a comment about it. It
Yeah.
seems that it's so
focused on parenting and not the larger context of the community, the schools, living in a very poor neighborhood, in a very violent community, kids witnessing violence a lot, and that's not considered a pathogenic realm.
Yeah, your point is very well taken, that it's considering parenting and the family, but not the greater community environment. And this is another one of those long-term drawbacks of the DSM, which is how it really thinks about contextual factors, often as an afterthought. And again, we're going to see cultures in the appendix. We're not going to see quite as much as we would have hoped in the context of the DSM itself, though there's going to be more there. So yes, I agree with you, this is a problem. The other problem is, everybody who works with children looks for externalizing disorders and internalizing disorders, and you're not going to see that language in the DSM as well. So the neurodevelopmental disorders, this is not just a rename from children, infancy, and adolescence. This is now a subcategory of early developmental difficulties that are thought to be genetically or chemically or biochemically induced rather than environmentally caused. So they've eliminated Rett disorders because it turns out Rett disorders has a particular genetic marker, much like Tay-Sachs or other kinds of genetic abnormalities that are found in certain populations, so they've taken it out of the DSM. MR has finally been renamed to intellectual developmental disability. Within the disability community, it's always called intellectual disability. In Great Britain, it's called learning disabilities, which is always confusing when you do a literature search and you have to look at what country the literature's from. But in 2011, Obama signed a decree that nothing connected with the government was allowed to use mental retardation anymore, that the correct language was intellectual disability. So they're almost there. They just threw in this other word, intellectual developmental disability. And they've put in language requires culturally appropriate testing. And so you would have to show that there are norms similar to the population of the person you are testing. But now IQ under 70 is not the only criteria, and I would say it should not be the main criteria. They have moved in the direction of most of the different organizations that work with people with intellectual disabilities, which is not to go by IQ, but to go by functioning level. And the question is, there are 5 different domains, and in each of those domains, to what degree is the person able to function independently? And that actually gives you a much better picture of the capabilities of the person than saying an IQ of 68, which doesn't tell you that much. Partly because there is this person interaction with the environment. 68, who's been hospitalized and institutionalized over their life, is very different than 68, who's been taught community care or community living.
Is it still 2 or more areas of significant impairment?
You have to see areas of impairment actually in all 5 of them, but you, to a greater or lesser degree.
So people could move in and out of this diagnosis theoretically as they become.
Theoretically, they could move in and out of this diagnosis, or you could look at them at their best. You could look at them at times of stress, and they might look very different. So it's a little bit more of a fluid definition. So what happened with ASD? This was a controversy for a very, very long time, autism spectrum disorders. And the controversy was Asperger's going to remain a separate category, or was it going to be put in the autism spectrum disorders? And what finally got decided was that there is going to be one disorder called autism spectrum disorders. It now has subsumed within it not only autism and Asperger's, but pervasive developmental disorder, NOS, and disintegrative disorder. So I don't know if you remember way back when we used to use the term high-functioning autism, and then they called that Asperger's. We're kind of now back to where we were before. In order to get the diagnosis, this is one where you have to have an elevated level on 5 out of 7 symptoms. And there's a real question about what this is going to mean for special services at schools. Is this going to get a whole new group of people into the category, or is it going to define out a whole group of people? ADHD, the subtypes have been eliminated. There was very, very low reliability across clinicians for the subtypes of ADHD, so it's now just one type. There are something like 23 tic disorders listed. I'm not going to go over those. But it's interesting, all throughout diagnoses, there's always been a back and forth between what is a medical disorder and what is a psychiatric disorder. And I think in these neurodevelopmental disorders, we see that mushing more than, if I can be technical here, that mushing more than any other place. You know, why are tic disorders in the DSM? If they're neurodevelopmental disorders? Well, because sometimes clinicians do treat them. But sometimes the decision will be to put it in the diagnostic system, and sometimes it doesn't go in. The learning disorders have been coalesced into one, and it's called specific learning disorder, and there are 4 subtypes, basically. It's about the acquisition and ability to use your academic skills in one of 4 areas or more than one area: oral language, reading, written language, and mathematics. It's so interesting to me that there's no specific learning disorder for art. I mean, it says something about what we value and what we think people should and shouldn't be able to do. Sensory integration disorder. If you worked with children, you know that this, at one point, somebody made it up and then it became hot, hot, hot. And the question was it going to be in the DSM-5? And ultimately, it is not in this section. It is in the section 3, requiring further study. So it didn't make it because they thought there wasn't enough research to support it yet. Now, we are going to see a little later on, there are many, many other diagnoses in DSM-5 that you can give to children. But you look to those chapters and you would give the same diagnostic code as you would for an adult, but there is going to be more text around the manifestation of different disorders in children.